this evening, and thank you to Betsy and Tammy for asking me to speak. As Betsy mentioned, my name is Lindsey Huling, and my connection to adoption is that I'm a birth mother. In July of 2008, it was the summer after my senior year of high school. I was ready to go off to college. I had a roommate. I had my class schedule, everything. And then I found out I was pregnant. And as scared as I was in that moment, I knew I could go to my parents. Even though we didn't have the most sentimental or emotional relationship growing up, they had always made my siblings and I feel comfortable in knowing that if we ever felt like we were in trouble, or if we ever felt that, we needed their assistance, they would be there to support us. So shortly after telling them that I was pregnant, I had their support, and my boyfriend and I started going to see an adoption counselor. We saw this counselor every month throughout my pregnancy, and there she helped us to create our adoption plan. And one thing I can remember her telling me is that I was going to grow attached to this child that was inside of me. And I genuinely thought in my naive 18-year-old mind that it wasn't going to happen to me. I wasn't going to feel an attachment. But I was wrong. And on March 20th, 2009, I gave birth to a beautiful baby boy. And I can assure you that no amount of counseling can prepare you for having your first child. And so much of my time at the hospital was a blur, but one thing I can remember is being wheeled out of the hospital alone, without my baby. And, I went into the hospital on like a Friday, and the following Wednesday, I was back at the local community college, sitting in like a math class, pretending like the biggest thing of my life hadn't happened 5 days prior. Nobody told me, you have to go back to school, you need to go home or forget. No one ever said that. But who was I supposed to talk to? I didn't know anybody who'd ever placed a child for adoption. I didn't even know at 19 years old anyone my age who'd had a child. And looking back at it now, I think about the fact that I gave birth 35 years after the baby scoop era, which, for those of you who don't know, is the time period between 1945 and 1973, when over 1 million pregnant girls were sent away to homes for unwed mothers, and they were told to relinquish their child for adoption. They were told to go home and forget and pretend like it never happened. But again, I gave birth in 2009, when at this point in time, teen pregnancy was on the rise. It was being talked about on a national scale. There was, and still is, a reality show on MTV about teen pregnancy. Yet, I still felt so alone, and I still felt like I didn't have anybody to talk to. And unlike Betsy in 1989, when she was, working on her adoption, I had the ability to use Google. And, I didn't know who to turn to, so I turned to Google. And thankfully for me, Adoption Network came up. And soon I was driving 35 minutes to the general meetings at Cleveland Heights, where I was able to hear from adoptees and adoptive parents and prospective adoptive parents about their experiences. And I was able to hear from adoptees talk about their emotions of what it was like to grow up in a family that wasn't biologically theirs. It helped me to help me to potentially connect with my son in the future of what his feelings may be. I started driving downtown to the old offices, to the birth mother support group. And at the time, I was the youngest birth mother in those groups by a number of years. Many of the women who were there were part of that baby scoop era. And I was able to hear from them about the shame that they felt, how they felt shunned from society, how they felt like everything was so secret. And while I wasn't shunned from society, I still felt the shame. I felt the shame that I was now a statistic, that I was a teen mom. And I felt like, who was I to be the one to choose to give away my baby when these women next to me didn't have a choice? Adoption Network helped so much in those first few years for me. But when my son was about 3 years old, I moved out of state. And every city that I went to, I searched for a support group that was similar to Adoption Network, and it didn't exist. There was always the support for the woman when she's pregnant, but there was never the support that I could find for the woman who was pregnant but wasn't parenting. And during this time frame of the years that I was away, my relationship with my son and his family was growing. We have an open adoption, so it was wonderful because I was able to see, photos, and we got together a few times a year. We'd exchange gifts, everything that you want. But I didn't have anybody to talk to about the emotional aspect of things, about the fact that every time you see a photo or you hear about what he did for the day, it's what could have been, you know? And no one tells you that every time you see them in person, that you have to walk away from them again, just like you walked away from them from the hospital. Fast forward to 2019, my son was 10 years old. Sorry, I can't read my paper here. It was 2019. My son was 10. I was going through a divorce. I was going through a depression. And I realized in that time frame just how much of the 7 years that I had been away, how many emotions I had suppressed down surrounding the adoption. And I knew I needed to come back to a meeting. So this time I knew what to Google Adoption Network Cleveland. And I was so excited to see that they now had general meetings all across the state. So that fall, I drove to the Summit County General Meeting, and walking into the building, I knew that I wouldn't know anybody in there personally, but I knew that I would be able to be with people who could relate to me and could connect. And sitting around that circle, the facilitator started to read the opening remarks, and I just started to cry. And I know for a fact that I just sobbed for the entire 2-hour meeting. I don't really know how much information I got out, but I'm so grateful for the people who were there that night because they just listened, they offered support, they passed me the tissue box, and they could relate to everything that I had gone through. And obviously you can't get all of your emotions of, adoption out in 1 2-hour meeting, so I went back the next month, and the next month, and the next month. And as March of 2020 hit, and the world was shutting down, Adoption Network didn't. They turned everything virtual, and soon I was going to general meetings with people from all over the world. We had people regularly coming from the state of Washington, Louisiana, North Carolina, even Mexico. One special program they did, they screened Ann Fessler's The Girls Who Went Away, and afterwards hosted a discussion after. There were over 100 registrants just for that meeting. And one of them was from Australia. And what that shows to me is that these services aren't being provided that are needed. Adoption Network provides unbiased support for everyone within the adoption community. And clearly, there's a lack of that around the nation and around the world. In the spring of 2021, Betsy approached me about helping to restart the birth mother support group that hadn't been meeting for years even prior to the pandemic. She told me about a new birth mother who had recently found the group because the organization was virtual, and she thought that she and I would be good co-facilitators. And much like her asking me to be on the board, and much like her asking me to do the speech, I felt extremely unqualified. But with the support of the Adoption Network Cleveland staff and with the support of the other general meeting facilitators, just before Mother's Day in May of 2021, my co-facilitator Nikki and I restarted the support group. And it's truly been one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. We have women who come to that group each month and they say, I've never been to a support group, or I've never met another birth mother, or I've never been able to talk about these emotions with anybody. While we have a wide range of ages of our birth mothers, many of them are still from that baby scoop era. And I can assure you that they may have been told to go home and forget and pretend like it didn't happen, but they never forgot, but they've been silenced for way too long. We recently, just a few months ago, had our largest age gap in terms of the ages of the children that had been placed for adoption. Our oldest birth mother, her son is in his mid-60s, and our youngest birth mother had placed just 8 months prior. We had a 63-year age gap between the women who were in our group. And what that shows me is that just like the mission of Adoption Network says, is that adoption is a lifelong, complex journey for all those whose lives are touched by it. I know that for me, my journey with my son is just beginning. This year he turned 13, and for the first time I was able to spend his birthday with him, his actual birthday, March 20th. And at 3:48 p.m., 13 years to the minute that he was born, I was able to take a photo with him. And then I was able to take a photo with he and his mom. And I know that he doesn't recognize how impactful that is or how unique of a situation that is. But my only hope is that as he gets older and as he maybe starts to have his own family, or as he wants to dive deep into his own emotions surrounding his adoption, that this organization is here for him. And I hope that the organization's there for me as my life with him gets older. And I want this organization to always be around for all of those whose lives are connected to the adoption community. Thank you.